have it offered at El Centro because they have a big fashion design program at that campus. But it's a fun class to take regardless. So if you're interested in that, look for it at within Dallas College or at the university that you go to. But there's so much about color that we really don't think about. The psychology behind color, the sources of pigments, how we see color, all of those things. And this website really explores all of it, and it provides a lot of its resources. So that's one of the things I really like about it. So have fun playing around and exploring this website. I think you'll learn a lot of new things. You can find fun facts about different colors. You can also find more things out about color symbolism. There's some interesting articles about gender and color and medicine and color. There's a section over color and design, and you can see some of the early stages of the color wheel versus what we have today. And you'll find more other interesting information about designs and logos and things like that. Here's a section over color and marketing. And I think a lot of you will find that interesting. We are manipulated quite a bit by the color of the packaging and stuff of the products that we buy. I love this section. It's called Color and the Body, and it talks about how color affects us and even our appetite. And so there's an article about the color blue and how it's not very appetizing, and how there's been different scientific tests that have to do with that. It's very, very fascinating if you're curious about that. And if you're looking for weight loss tips, they talk about a few in this article. And then they also talk about the color pink and how it makes people physically weak. And then even the color of medicine and the kind of psychology behind that we want to take medicine that's certain colors when we're feeling certain illnesses or ailments. And then this part is probably the most interesting for this class, is it talks about color and vision matter. And so I wanted to show you this. It talks about how yellow is the brightest, which we talked about in value, in the value unit, when we were talking about taking a photograph of the color wheel in black and white, how yellow would be the brightest. It also talks about how it makes you pay attention, but it also can be kind of fatiguing if you stare at it too long, and it has similar effects on our brain as caffeine. Then it goes on to talk about how red is one of the more aggressive colors, and it shows you a cool little eye trick. If you stare at this little black dot on the left for a few seconds and then look at the black dot on the right side, you'll actually start to see a bluish green floating rectangle, and that is what we call an after image. And the reason that you see a bluish green color is because that is projected or computer lights coming through. It's the complementary color to the red. Now in a painting color wheel, the complementary color of red is green, but with projected light and digital imagery, it's a cyan kind of color. So that's why you see that after image. And then it goes on to further explain that after image idea with this star here. So if you stare at the black dot and this white star, and then look over in this white square, you'll actually start to see a floating black star. And that is, again, an after image. Same principles as the red one, but with red we're seeing color. With the black and white, we're not seeing color. And so this is the after image that we see. And this is why when we looked at the element of line and we looked at artists like Bridget Riley's work that created op art, that's the reason why we saw those vibrating or moving lines, is because whenever we look at something really bright and white, it does kind of stimulate our brain and say that's a lot of white. And so whenever we look away from it, if it's an area of solid white, wherever we were seeing just a section of white before, our brains and our eyes work together to block out the light in that area. And that's why you see that after image. And so that's how we're able to create optical illusions in art and in the world around us. So it's kind of interesting. So there's a lot of other stuff on here. It talks about color and science and like where pigments come from and things like that. So have fun exploring this website. And this is the um, website for Winsor Newton art products. And they have several videos that they call their master classes. These are all very, very short. And but you can see that they have videos over watercolors, stippling, um, using markers to blend, all sorts of different things. And there's, I think, hundreds of videos on their website. So I wanted you to see there are free additional resources if you're wanting to experiment with other things. And a lot of times students, I know, like, well, I went to the art store and I didn't know what to buy and I didn't know how to use this stuff. And most of the companies have these video tutorials on their website, so you can kind of look to see what these materials do before you buy them. But then also once you buy them, if you want to learn new ways to use them, they have a lot of these different videos explaining that on their site. So I encourage you to explore some of those. Golden Paint has the same thing. So does Liquitex and many others. So I just wanted to show you that, and I could show you these all day long, but there's a lot of these and most of them are under 5 minutes long. And then lastly, these are some examples of students' projects from the past. And so I was going to show you some of these. Now, let's see, this was a demo that I did. But you can see a lot of these, they're on the 14 by 17 paper, and then they're utilizing all the colors on the color wheel. Even though sometimes it may be kind of hard to find all the colors, remember you don't have to use the colors in equal quantity. And so these are usually pretty fun to look at. Some of these may not quite have followed all the instructions, but of course you'll want to do that for your project. Some of these, they kind of leave me wanting more. So yeah, these may just be a point of inspiration to jump off from. So there's so many different types of tattoos now too that they used to be all outlined in black, and they kind of had a certain look to them. But now we're starting to see more and more tattoos that are full body covering. They look like splash paint, things like that. So I think you'll be able to kind of get your interest in the work as well. So you have a link to these and you can look at more if you want. Notice there, in a beginning drawing class, there's always a lot of eyes and hearts and things like that, which is fine. Here's another one, a couple more that I did. This was one I designed a couple of years ago. These were just me playing on my sketchbook paper, coming up with different ideas. And then this was one that I designed that actually kind of fights. I think I redid it for like a project example too. And I think I have some more in here too. Yeah, these were some from last semester when we were in COVID, when we first got quarantined. So anyway, you have a lot of examples to look at. And some may be better than others. Again, these are not for you to think, oh, I'm going to do something similar, but more for you just to see what other students have done with it before. Again, try to keep it original and make a beautiful design, like something you would be proud of. All right. Okay, so now I'm going to switch back over to this. And then I wanted to share my other camera with you. I'm going to just show you some of this different color media, and some of the things that you can do with it. Okay, so hopefully you can hear and see from this little camera here. And I have a lot of different color media out. I just wanted to show you what some of these different things did. Of course, you're not going to need all of these things, and you may not have quite all of this stuff at home. I haven't always either. These are things I've collected over, probably the last 15, 20 years. So a lot of these art supplies, especially like watercolor and things like that, they last a really long time. In the PowerPoint lecture, I'm going to go over more of the color wheel, but I wanted to show you acrylic paint is wonderful, and really it dries faster. You can get a full range of colors, and it can look just like oil paint if it's done correctly, if that's what you're going for. But it also can be thinned with water and made to look more like watercolor. So if you have acrylic, which I believe it came with your kit, you can kind of water it down to use it like watercolor on your Bristol board paper. Okay. If you are working with it on canvas, however, you probably don't want to add too much water to it because it will break the paint down. But if you're working on paper, it absorbs it, so it will be okay. These are all little swatches of color of these acrylic paints here. And I showed you how to mix those for the value project. And so it's the same process if you're wanting to mix like two colors to each other. You'll do that same method I showed you of making different values, just using two different colors and mixing them to each other to create, those secondary and tertiary colors in between those two colors. So you had, I have two different reds, two different blues, and two different yellows, because within each primaries, there's going to be a warmer and a cooler primary. So that's how you get some of the other colors, in it that you see. So whenever I was a kid, I know sometimes I would mix like whatever blue and yellow paint that I had, and they always wouldn't look green. And so now I know, because like phthalo blue is cooler and lemon yellow is cooler. When I mix those two together, that makes a truer bright green. Where if I mix cadmium red, which is closer to the reds, and ultramarine blue, which is closer to the reds, that's going to make a darker green, like a hunter green or a forest green. All right, so you'll learn some of that. I think I talked more about that in the lecture, and that's something you would learn more in a painting class, which I teach as well. But I wanted you to see you could use the acrylic, but notice when you're looking at this acrylic paint up close, just like with the value project, if you work with the acrylic and you're really wanting it to look like a tattoo, normally tattoos don't have texture, right? So I don't know if acrylic would really be the best unless you have really good experience of working with it really thin. If you get too much texture, it may kind of take away from the idea that it's a tattoo. Okay, you can totally use it if that's all you have. You can make it work. But sometimes students will tell me like, well, it got so thick. And so you have to remember, if you are working with it and you're wanting it to look kind of like transparent layers or like a tattoo or watercolor, you will need to add a little water to the acrylic to help thin it down so it lays flat and it doesn't build up that texture like a painting. Okay. Then the next thing I have several types of, well, first I was just going to show you, this is an art magazine I just got in the mail the other day. My work's been published in this magazine probably about 10 times now over the last several years. But what I wanted to show you is, I haven't looked at every page of this book yet, but I wanted you to see how there are color schemes that artists capture those naturally, and sometimes intentionally, sometimes just because that's what they've learned. But here we have a monochromatic photograph using just green. Here we have a complementary color scheme with red and green. And if you don't know what words that I'm using right now, you'll learn those in the PowerPoint. Here we have an analogous color scheme. That means colors that are neighbors. So we see green and then yellow-green used together. So when I'm showing this again, more analogous color schemes with the cool greens and yellows side of the color wheel. And the reason I'm showing you this here is some more complementary with reds and greens. I'm showing you these because a lot of times students think, like, why do I need to use a color scheme? And I'm like, well, you really see them everywhere. So sometimes it helps your design quite a bit. Here's a monochromatic yellow color scheme. Here's some more kind of analogous ones using different greens and blue greens. So anyway, I wanted you to see that we actually do see color schemes used quite a bit around us. So anyway. All right, and then I have some paper here. This is just some watercolor paper that I'm just going to be doing some examples on. And I have several types of watercolor. This is probably what most of you grew up using, something like this. I don't even think the one I had when I was a kid was this nice, but you've all probably used these kind of watercolors before. They work fine, but I wanted to show you that there are some other options as well for watercolors. You can find them in tubes that you can actually squirt the colors out into a palette and they can dry, or you can work with them liquid and add water. This is a set I got last year for Christmas, and I really like it. It's got 42, I think, colors, and it opens up like this. And it also came with these pins that you can put water in, and then you squeeze them, and that's what allows you to pick up the color and blend the color on the paper. And so it's kind of fun, like your water is contained within the pen. But these were pretty fun, and I think I got this on Amazon, and it was under $20, and it's lasted a really long time, and I've done a lot of stuff with it. So there's lots of different variations of watercolor. And then here, this is the watercolor tube set that I was talking about. So the colors come in tubes, and then you can squirt them out and mix them, and then they can dry, and you just come back with your brush and water. This one actually has several palettes, so I have kind of a warm and a cool one, and you can see that I've used it quite a bit. These really never go bad. Even if the color dries in the tube, you can cut them open and then still use it out of the tube because it's always water soluble. So those are all different examples of watercolor. And I'll just show you what they look like on the paper. Let's see, I'll use this one. I'm going to just use this one that I have out. So to work with it, you need water and a brush. You'll want to wet the brush. And then wet the paint. And the more water that you add, then the more transparent it will be, and it will be more of what we call a light wash. And then you put it on your paper. If you want it to be darker, you're just going to have to add some more water and mix that more in the palette, and then put it back on the paper. Now, you can also do some really fun effects with watercolor. Just any of the techniques I showed you with India ink, you can also do with watercolor. So you can make the colors bleed by adding water. You can wet the paper first and then put the watercolor on it. All of those techniques I showed you with India ink, they work with watercolor as well. So if I wanted to create a gradation and have this kind of fade into orange, I could put these two next to each other, and actually I could, because it's already wet, they'll continue to bleed over time. If you get an area too dark, one thing you can do is wet it, and then take a paper towel, and then you can blot it, and you can actually pick up some of the watercolor. So a lot of people like working with watercolor because it can be pretty forgiving if you make a mistake. You can get a lot of it off of the paper. Now these other brushes that I have, with these you can put water in them. This one works better. So you can kind of squeeze them and then they suck the water up in them, or you can fill them up like at the sink. But you see the bristles are actually the brush, and then the water's in here. So all you have to do is just rub, this onto your watercolor, and then if you want to create a lighter wash, you can just keep squeezing the pen, and it will squeeze out more water. So it's really fun and really easy to use, and you can blend these colors together if you don't have the full range. That's one thing that's nice about watercolor, is that you can kind of create all those ranges of color that you're going to be required to have by mixing these into each other pretty easily. All right. So that is using the more traditional watercolors. And then the other thing I was going to show you, these are what are called watercolor pencils. So these look like regular color pencils, but they are water soluble. So these are fun. You can sketch with them. And then take your brush, and as you go over them, it activates that watercolor, and you can blend them into each other. So some people kind of like these because they're kind of like combining drawing and painting together. And then you can also draw back on top of them while it's wet if you wanted to create more definition. Usually you can come back over and draw more on top of it with the pencils and then add more, or just leave it. Some people combine these with the traditional watercolor and also regular color pencils too. So you don't always have to blend it out, but you do have that option. They're also, when you dip them in the water, they work more kind of like a marker. They make more of a fluid mark rather than a dry mark. So you can kind of use them as a marker that way too. I would never leave it in the water though, because I think that would probably make the wood rot in the pencil. So watercolor pencils are great, and they have different brands and things that you can get at the store that are, some are more expensive than others, but they do last quite a while. And then the next thing I was going to show you are watercolor markers. So I got this, I think this set was under $15, and it comes with 24 different markers. And this set came with one of these watercolor water pens as well, or brushes. That's really nice. So these are just like the watercolor pencils, but it is a marker. So you can draw with the marker. This paper is really rough, so that's why it's not really picking up. These were pretty inexpensive too, so that could be it as well. But then you can come back with your brush and water, and you can kind of blend these together. So you can see different products, different media, but they kind of have the same, you can make them have similar results. So those are watercolor markers. And again, you don't need all of these. I'm just showing you some of the different things that you could possibly use, and you may experiment with these different things if you have them and kind of find which one you feel is your strength to work with for the project. And then I have some color pencils as well. I'm going to grab a couple of these. Now these are regular color pencils that that they're not water soluble, but you can still create a nice range of values by working with them on the paper. So if you wanted to create a range of colors. You can press down the color pencil, kind of harden. With colored pencils, for it to not look like, I would say, elementary work, then it's really all about layering. And it takes a while. And that's why you don't see a lot of colored pencil artwork at college level, is because usually students in college have to start working a lot larger, and they also have to work a lot faster. And so, typically if you're going to make a 14 by 17 inch drawing, and you're going to use all color pencils, and it's going to take quite a bit of time to really blend those and layer those and add all the details and things like that. But these are nice because you can really layer them. It just takes a lot of time, and I try to cover it up, all of the white of the paper, and just get it really, where it almost looks like a painting when it's finished. And then some sets will have like a blender, but I've also found you can use the white color pencil, that if you come back over the other colors, it helps kind of blend them and incorporate them into each other a little bit more. So you're going to be able to use whichever media that you like for this. I'm just showing you some of these fun things. And then the last thing I have is gouache, and that's these little tubes here. And this is kind of, it is basically a opaque watercolor. So a lot of people use these along with watercolor. They come in block sets and then also in tubes like this. And so I just have an old egg carton that I was going to put some of these in. And these are like watercolor. You can squirt them out and then let them dry. And then you can still come back and use them. So I usually will make a palette with these on, if I'm traveling or something, they're kind of fun to travel with watercolor. But these are opaque. So where the watercolor makes these transparent layers, the gouache, it's opaque. It has a chalk added to it, which makes it thicker and more opaque. But you can still thin it, but it stays pretty opaque still because of the chalk added to it. A lot of interior designers and fashion designers will use watercolor and gouache together, because they have to represent different textiles that may be transparent, and then some that may be more opaque. So they like to have watercolor that makes, could represent maybe the transparent fabrics like silks and things like that, or organza or whatever it's called. And then they like to have the gouache for, thicker opaque materials and fabrics, such as like maybe velvet and upholstery materials and things like that. So you often see watercolor and gouache used together. There's one person I follow on Instagram, and she makes a little small gouache painting every single day of just like an everyday still life object. And most days she sells it, and that's how she makes her living as an artist. She just does a daily painting, and they're small and pretty affordable, and they look really good. And she's created kind of a whole business of these daily paintings with gouache on paper. So with gouache and watercolor, you mostly always will use them on paper. To use them on canvas, you have to treat the canvas a certain way for it to be able to absorb the stain or the watercolor. So usually you only use oil or acrylic on canvas unless it's been treated with something to make it take the watercolor. So I put the gouache into these little egg carton containers, and I just wanted you to see how it looks compared to the watercolor. So I'm going to pick up a little bit of this, and I'm just going to put a swatch next to the other color. So I've watered this down, but do you see how much more opaque it is compared to the watercolor. And then I'll do the same with some yellow. So you can see how, even though this yellow is watered down, it's still really opaque compared to the watercolor. So you can see why people like to use the two together. And even as I thin out the gouache, it still stays really opaque. So you can see why people like to use the two together, watercolor and gouache. All right, well, that shows you several different color media that you may be interested in using for your project. My suggestion would be to design, 10 different designs in your sketchbook, play around kind of like I am, using different colors, different media, and then kind of look at it all and decide what you want to do for the bigger project that we'll be working on next week. But I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you're excited that we're finally to color, and I look forward to seeing your work.